Hello everyone, today I have a guide for you on how I roughly determine what shells are useful on a ship and what shells are traps or not immediately worth your time researching when you're going through your modifications. I will say ahead of all this that a lot of what I choose is based mainly on how it feels to use them in game, so results may differ for people with different playstyles. Knowing what you are shooting at and what shell to choose is a large part of this, but that is covered in another one of my guides, so I won't be touching on it heavily here. I will state outright that I typically base all my judgments off comparative Japanese shells, as I really enjoy how their shells perform across most of their ships. I will also be avoiding things that are attributed mainly to your gun, like velocity or accuracy, and will be grouping the shells into their general categories rather than getting into specifics. So I will be referring to them broadly as high explosive, semi-armor piercing, and armor piercing only. I also want to restate that I consider most anti-aircraft shells as a trap and won't be talking about them here. Generally, I look at three main stats when I determine a shell's usefulness. The first of those being penetration. This is a fairly easy one, as anyone can tell you that penetration is king. If you can't damage your targets, then the shell is almost useless. Too much penetration though is an issue when it comes to facing lighter ships, as your shells will just pass through them and do little to no damage, either acting as a solid shot where whatever your shell passed through will be damaged and that is it, or just flying through their hull and not exploding, aka just making a hole in each side of them, probably not even below the waterline. How much penetration you need to be comfortable on the ship that you're playing is really heavily dependent on what you'll be mainly facing, as if you're seeing a lot of destroyers, you're obviously not going to be wanting to pack armor piercing, that's just going to zip through them as I stated before. Once again, that's a different guide, we're going to get right past that. The penetration charts in game do show how your penetration decreases over distance, which you can use to determine if that particular shell is suited better for close range engagements or long distance sniping. It also shows how your shells perform against angled targets, which helps you know whether you should swap targets to something more broadside or aim for different spots on your targeted enemy in order to penetrate flatter sections, especially if your shells really don't like to penetrate anything that is angled. Moving on from penetration though, we have explosive mass or explosive filler. This is typically best shown as a TNT equivalent stat, and basically shows how much damage your shell will do when it explodes inside of an enemy ship. The more explosive mass that your shell has, the more devastating a proper hit can be. While this does still require you to penetrate your target to deal this damage when you are using some semi-armor piercing and armor piercing rounds, some semi-armor piercing and high explosive rounds can compensate for the lower penetration by having massive amounts of explosive filler, and rely mainly on that to deal internal damage or flood enemy ships with massive holes in their sides from just a giant freaking explosion. The British line has many such examples of this, such as their heavy cruisers and 13.5-inch armed battleships that enjoy tossing semi-armor piercing rounds downrange that contain massive amounts of explosive filler. On the flip side of that, not enough explosive filler basically turns your shells into solid shot rounds, forcing you to directly hit modules with your shells to damage them, while also not damaging anything around them. Easy examples of this are the British 4-inch semi-armor piercing rounds and the American 6-inch armor piercing rounds. They're just going to hit something, and if you hit a module it'll damage it, but if you don't, it's going to act like you overpenetrated and just zip right through the enemy ship or just not deal much damage at all. And last but certainly not least for the three is fuse settings. The shell fuse delay and sensitivity are both interesting stats that until recently I didn't really take much notice of. The sensitivity is how far the shell has to penetrate in order to trigger the fuse delay, and after the fuse delay is done, your shell explodes, presumably deep inside the enemy vessel. As with penetration, too much of either of these can cause your shells to over-penetrate more times than not. The opposite, however, can make your shells very finicky with penetration, causing them to detonate on deck modules or inside of armor plating and negating all of their damage. With these types of shells, you are lucky to penetrate deep enough to even damage ammo elevators sometimes, and usually they're not buried far below decks. The British 13.5-inch battleship's armor piercing is a great example of the latter of these two scenarios, as these shells have an extremely short fuse delay and low sensitivity values, causing them to detonate extremely early when hitting an enemy ship. I mean, sometimes you can just hit the enemy ship's funnel from straight down, and these shells will not even damage that sometimes. With all that being said, I'm going to try something a little new here, and that is a spreadsheet comparison. I'll be showing a few comparisons between different ships, their selection of ammo, and why certain shells either perform better than others, or are complete RP drains for that specific ship. Hopefully this helps show off some of my above points a little bit better with actual in-game values. For ease of comparisons, the filler will be in TNT equivalent mass, the penetration will be the highest attainable number, and base fuse high explosive will be considered for the semi-armor piercing category if that ship doesn't have a dedicated semi-armor piercing rounds. And the British line is going to be picked on a lot heavily here, as it has some shells with massively different statistics than the other lines. And like I said in the intro, I'll be using a lot of Japanese ships as baselines. Moving into my amateur spreadsheets though, first up we will be comparing the light cruisers with the USS Cleveland, the IJN Suzuya, HMS Southampton, and Nuremberg. I know Nuremberg's a little bit lower in BR than the other three, but I found it a decent comparison. High explosives obviously are all fairly similar. You're going to see that across the board, though it is good to note that the USS Cleveland has a much higher filler amount than the other ones, and even though the penetration looks lower by that little 8mm difference, that high explosive filler really makes up the difference in that and turns them into a very effective shell. But across the board, they're all fairly good at their job as just being high explosive shells. The semi-armor piercing category though is where you start seeing differences between the ships. Obviously the Japanese don't have a shell for this, but you can look at the Cleveland, which this is its base fuse high explosives, so if you look at the penetration it doesn't seem like much, but these are actually pretty good shells. And of course, if you look at the filler, it's the same as the high explosives, which is what's giving it all of its power, along with another thing that I'll touch on in a minute. You can see that the Southampton has a lot of penetration, but not a lot of filler compared to the other two ships here, and the Nuremberg kinda has a median between these two. Now where it gets interesting is the fuse delays. The base fuse high explosive on Cleveland is so good because it has a long fuse delay and has to be deep in the enemy ship, at least sensitivity wise compared to the other ones, before it actually detonates. If you look at the other two ships, they have extremely fast fuse delay timers and very low amounts to trigger that fuse, which sets them off fairly early compared to where the Cleveland is, where it'll just chew stuff apart before, say, the Southampton can really even start to damage it, making the Cleveland shells that much better even though they're not true semi-armor piercing shells. Now that kind of flips when you go down to the armor piercing category. You can see that the Cleveland has the lowest penetration here, but also has the lowest amount of filler. It's one of those ships where it drops below a kilogram of filler, and usually when it does that, they're not extremely good shells, especially if they're above the 4.5-inch caliber, I'd say. Once you start seeing them in the grams, in Naval, that's basically solid shot. And once again, it does have a shorter fuse on it, just by the sensitivity rating, and really it just doesn't make for a very good shell. Yes, you can hit modules with it because it does have enough penetration to deal with other cruisers, but the filler just isn't there to actually back it up with damage. If you look at the other two ships here, the IJ and Suzuya has the best penetration, the best filler amount, a fairly decent fuse delay, and just overall has the best shell here. And you can see that reflected in game because it really does tear apart enemy ships with its armor-piercing shells. Southampton obviously doesn't have an armor-piercing round, it relies entirely on those semi-armor piercing rounds. And Nuremberg, being at a slightly lower battle rating than Suzuya, still has a decent amount of filler and penetration, though the fuse delay does leave a little bit to be desired as it is so quick. You wouldn't think that that small difference in such a small number makes that much of a difference, but when it's trying to bore its way through armor, it does make quite a bit of difference. And that's a lot of differences in a sentence, but that's the best way I can put it. There's still a very good shell, don't get me wrong, but the short delay does hinder it a little bit. Moving on to the heavy cruisers, once again you can see they all have fairly standard high explosive rounds. Very similar stats across the board, with the HMS York being the highest for filler, and overall, yeah, they all do their jobs, they're good high explosive rounds. For the semi-armor piercing category is where things get a little bit different. Obviously Mogami doesn't have a shell for this category and will be left out, but HMS York has the most penetration at a considerable 270mm, while New Orleans really slacks off with the 132mm of penetration that it has. And that really leaves it hurting sometimes. It really can't use these shells to effectively fight a lot of targets that it sees. As far as filler amounts go, once again New Orleans slacks off on this, while the other two have very respectable 5.3, 5.2 kilogram loads. And the fuse delay is once again where this gets interesting, because the American and the German ship here, the Admiral Hipper, have longer fuse delays than the York while having the same fuse sensitivity, meaning their shells, when they do penetrate, will go deeper and deal their damage to more internal modules rather than external where the York will. Not saying that it's a massive difference between the two, but it is considerable when it comes to this shell. Looking at the armor piercing though, you can see that York doesn't have one. It relies solely on that semi-armor piercing with the heavy high explosive load to deal all its damage, whereas the rest of the ships have fairly standard armor piercing shells, with the exception of, once again, New Orleans. The other two have fairly decent filler amounts, with 3.2 on the Mogami and 2.65 on the Admiral Hipper, and the Admiral Hipper once again takes the cake with the 426mm of penetration. If that thing's looking at you, most likely it's going to try to just stuff that through your armor. The New Orleans, however, with that really light filler amount, really feels like it's using solid shot sometimes. That 1.62 kilograms doesn't go a long way when it comes to fighting bigger ships. Say if you were fighting a smaller light cruiser, I mean smaller, like not standard looking, that filler might do a lot of damage, but at that point you might as well just use your semi-armor piercing. These shells will penetrate, but once again they're not going to deal much damage. On the flip side though, going down to the fuse delays, you can see that the Admiral Hipper and the New Orleans both have the same delay and sensitivity, making them trigger rather quickly compared to the Mogami, which is very good and very well known for just driving its shells straight into people's magazines and not really caring. The Mogami's shells are built to be diving shells, so they need to have a little bit more delay to dive under the water and then still go through a little bit of armor to get to magazines. So that longer delay really helps it when it's trying to bore its way through armor, or like I said, using its shells as diving shells. Definitely makes it the best round for that ship, and makes the armor piercing for the New Orleans kinda look crappy, I guess would be the best way to put it. And in a way, yes, those shells kinda are. Next up we have the battleships, with the USS Nevada, the IJN Congo, the HMS Marlborough, and the Mackinson. The high explosives on these are a little bit interesting, not just because Mackinson doesn't have any, and the penetration, if you just looked at that, they're all fairly similar, but the filler amounts are where it gets interesting. The British definitely take the cake with almost a double load of explosive filler compared to the other two, and that actually makes these shells somewhat useful even though it's fighting other battleships. You can cause a lot of flooding with that 88 kilograms of filler. These can be a rather devastating shell in the right situation, and definitely shouldn't be underestimated if you're just deciding what to take out with your British ships. Moving down to semi-armor piercing, you see kind of the same situation. The Congo does beat the Brits in the filler amount on this one, but the Brits still have the better shell in my opinion. It takes a little bit longer for it to actually trigger, meaning that semi-armor piercing is going to dig into that enemy ship just a little bit more and just do more damage. The semi-armor piercing on the Congo just really doesn't like to perform, even though it has such a heavy filler amount and has the same penetration as the HMS Marlborough. That fuse delay just really lets it down. The Mackinson, on the other hand, has a little bit more penetration, a little bit smaller filler, and about a split difference between the two when it comes to fuse delay. So while it shouldn't be underestimated on the Mackinson, I don't think it's the best shell choice for this ship. That would be down to the armor piercing category. Now, just looking at penetration, they all are fairly similar. The Congo definitely wins. I fully expected that too. But when you look at the filler, the Mackinson actually wins in this category. And that's why I said that the semi-armor piercing rounds, while they can be handy on it, aren't the best. You can see that the semi-armor piercing and the armor piercing have the same delays, but despite having less filler, you're going to go a lot deeper into the enemy ship with the armor piercing and have a better chance of defeating armor. Overall, I'd consider them the better shell when it comes to the Mackinson. On the flip side, the Marlborough, if you're comparing the semi-armor piercing to the armor piercing, it's just, no, don't use the armor piercing. And I say that because while the penetration does look good, and the filler looks okay, I mean it's more than the Congo, and I said those were basically my baseline, the fuse delay is where it gets interesting, because the armor piercing actually has a shorter fuse delay and lower fuse sensitivity than the semi-armor piercing rounds, and that will lead these to be very frustrating shells to use. I'm not saying don't take any of them because they can be useful in the right scenario, but you're going to find that you're just going to destroy the turret or destroy the smoke funnel or maybe the bridge. It's really just going to destroy deck modules. They're not going to penetrate unless they hit a very lightly armored section of the ship, in which case once they do hit something, they're not going to go much further. The semi-armor piercing just acts a lot better with this ship, and you'll find yourself doing more consistent damage. As far as the Congo goes, it is the complete opposite. Even though the filler got a lot lower, the penetration is a lot better, the fuse delay is a lot longer, looking more like the Mogami than the semi-armor piercing rounds do, and overall is definitely your go-to shell on this ship. These are very good, and like I said, it is my baseline for the rest of the ships when I'm going to consider, is this shell any good or is it not? Especially when I pulled out Marlborough and tried to figure out, I guess the previous British ships, but tried to figure out why my armor piercing rounds weren't really doing anything. And of course, Nevada's down at the end with the best filler, short of the Mackinson, and a very, very respectable amount of penetration, good delays, good sensitivities overall, making it a very effective shell. And lastly, I want to look at an interesting switch in a line that I recently got to, and that is the British battleships with their 13.5-inch guns on HMS Marlborough, moving on to the 15-inch guns on HMS Repulse. If you just look at it, they've both got semi-armor piercing and armor piercing rounds, which is what you want at this. The high explosive rounds on the Marlborough are pretty useful, but overall you're not going to be throwing those for the most of the game. When you look at the semi-armor piercing, it gets rather interesting. When you move to the 15 inch, the penetration actually goes down versus the 13.5 inch that Marlboro has. The filler amount does get a little bit bigger, which makes sense, but the fuse times get shorter, which makes these a very finicky shell, and just overall makes them very hard to work with. You have to remember that Repulse is facing bigger ships and has bigger guns. You expect it to penetrate more, you expect it to hit harder, and it just doesn't. The penetration isn't there. The filler, while it is a little bit bigger, it's not that much bigger, and it doesn't make up for that lack of penetration. And then the fuse delay on top of that means that you're not going to be beating your way through the more heavily armored ships that you're going to be seeing. The armor piercing, on the other hand, shows that the British have flipped around what they're trying to do here. The penetration gets a lot better. The filler amount actually goes up even though your penetration's getting better. And while your fuse delay stays the same, the fuse sensitivity actually gets bigger, meaning that it'll take a little bit more armor to set that off, which makes the world of difference. While I'm not a massive fan of Repulse yet because I find her guns to be extremely inaccurate, I do like that the fuse sensitivity is a lot better and my armor piercing rounds can do a lot more than I could with Marlboro's armor piercing rounds. Relying on the semi-armor piercing on Marlboro had me struggling sometimes, whereas now that I'm in Repulse, I can just switch to firing mainly armor piercing and just leaving the semi-armor piercing in the hangar because it's really not that useful. It's just an interesting spot where the line takes all that you've learned so far about its battleships and just turns it on its head and says you're using the armor piercing now, good luck. But with that, it's the end of this guide. Hopefully it helped you out. Hopefully I kinda explained how I actually choose my shells in a relatively comprehensible manner, and if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Good luck out there, guys. I'll see you in the next one.